Hassan, can you put it on recording, please? Assalamu alaikum, everyone. As you know, we've been covering manufacturing consent, and after completing the different uh, aspects of how manufacturing consent exists within like different pillars and the different aspects of it, now we're going to deep dive into three main case studies that has been discussed by Noam Chomsky in the book, and we're going to start off with Nicaragua. And today we're not just studying Nicaragua, we're going to study how a country can become a battlefield for ideology, media narratives, and global power. I'll be covering Nicaragua between 1979 and 1990, and this is the exact period where revolution, Cold War politics, media framing, and international intervention collided. And this is not a simple story of how communist versus capitalists exist in this world. It's exactly the story of how history creates conditions for revolution, how superpowers transform local conflicts into proxy wars, and how media narratives shape what the world believes is legitimate or illegitimate. The key question throughout my presentation would be how a domestic revolution becomes transformed into a geopolitical weapon. And to answer that, we will use three analytical frameworks, which I will go through: historical casuality, Cold War geopolitics, and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model for manufacturing consent. To understand Nicaragua properly, we'll need to move through three layers, and the first layer is historical casualty. The Sandinista revolution did not appear suddenly in 1979. It emerged from centuries of foreign intervention, economic inequality, dictatorship, and social resentment. The second layer is geopolitical escalation. Once the revolution succeeded, Nicaragua stopped being only a domestic issue. The Cold War transformed into a strategic conflict between the United States and the socialist bloc. The third layer is manufacturing consent, and this is where the media becomes extremely important. The 1984 Nicaraguan election became more than an election. It became a symbolic battlefield where media narratives determined whether Nicaragua was viewed as democratic or authoritarian. So, throughout my presentation, we'll keep this progression in mind: how history creates instability, how the Cold War militarizes the country, and how media interprets it for the world. To understand why the revolution happened, we need to go far back into Nicaragua's history. The first major event was the Spanish colonialism. The colonial rule established an extractive economy where wealth and power were concentrated into elite groups. This created deep inequality and racial hierarchy within the country. And then came American intervention. Between 1912 and 1933, US Marines occupied Nicaragua. Officially, this was to stabilize the country and protect American interests. But strategically, the United States wanted influence over Central America and possible canal routes. One of the most important outcomes of this occupation was the creation of the National Guard. Now, this is very critical. The US did not just support a dictatorship later, it helped create the military institution that made dictatorship structurally possible in Nicaragua. The Guard eventually came under Anastasio Somoza Garcia. He seized the power in 1937 and began the Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua. For around 44 years, Nicaragua effectively became a family controlled state. The army, businesses, land, and politics were tied to the Somoza family. Corruption became massive. One famous example was the 1972 earthquake. International aid meant for victims was allegedly stolen or redirected by the regime. And over time, this produced revolutionary anger. People increasingly viewed the state not as a protector but as an instrument of elite exploitation. Now, over here, I want to show the clash between two completely different versions of Nicaragua. On one side is the Somoza dynasty, and on the other side was Augusto Caesar Sandino. Now, the Somoza dynasty was a system where authoritarian capitalism and personal dictatorship was deeply embedded. The National Guard crushed resistance, and the United States supported the regime because it acted as a reliable anti communist ally during the Cold War. For Washington, stability mattered more than democracy. Remember that. While Augustus Caesar Sandino became the symbolic father of anti imperialist resistance, he fought against the US Marines and rejected foreign domination. After peace negotiations, Sandino was assassinated by forces connected to Somoza. Now, this transformed him into something larger than a political figure. He became a national myth. The Sandinista movement later took his name. And so the revolution was not just Marxist, it was emotionally tied to the ideas of national dignity, betrayed sovereignty, and resistance against the foreign control. This is very important because revolutionary movements survive not only through weapons, but also through myths, symbols, and collective memory. The Sandinistas were not driven by a single ideology. Their movement was actually a fusion of several intellectual traditions. First was Sandinismo. This provided the nationalist foundation, resistance to foreign domination and the idea of reclaiming sovereignty. Second was Marxism Leninism. This gave the movement an analysis of class struggle. It framed society as a conflict between wealthy elites and oppressed peasants and workers. It also justified disciplined revolutionary organization. Third was revolutionary socialism. This focused on practical reforms such as land redistribution, literacy programs, healthcare, nationalization of key industries. The fourth was liberation theology. This is especially important in Latin America, and we're going to discuss this later on. Some Christians thinkers basically argued that true faith required siding with the poor against oppressed people. So religion and revolution became connected, which was a new idea. Finally, the Sandinista were influenced by global anti colonial struggles. They saw themselves as part of the same historical wave as Cuba, Vietnam, and Algeria. So the Sandinista viewed itself not only as a political movement, but they have now aligned themselves as a global struggle against imperialism, which was very smart. In 1979, the Sandinista finally overthrew the Somoza regime, but they inherited a devastated country. Around 30,000 people had died, and approximately 500,000 were homeless. Initially, the revolution had broad support. Students, workers, moderators, parts of the Catholic Church, and even some business groups supported removing the Somoza family. The Sandinista also achieved important social reforms. They launched the campaigns that I've mentioned before regarding redistributing land and literacy programs. Expanding the healthcare was also a very big one. These reforms genuinely improved many people's life in the country. However, this is where the contradiction of revolutionary power appears. To defend the revolution, the Sandinista increasingly merged party power with state power. Sandinista Defense Committee monitored communities and centralized authority. Supporters argued that this was necessary because the revolution was under attack. However, critics argued it was creating authoritarian structures in the country. What was real? This is one of the major themes in revolutionary history. Can a revolution defend itself without becoming more centralized and controlling? That tension becomes even more intense once the Cold War escalates in the global regime. Over here, I'm trying to explain how Nicaragua became trapped in a Cold War spiral. If you look closely, the Sandinista moved further left politically. They expropriated Somoza properties and deepened socialist reforms because they feared military attack. They increasingly relied on Cuba and the Soviet bloc for weapons, advisors, and economic support. But this dependence alarmed the United States. The region administration believed Nicaragua could become a Soviet Cuban beachhead in Central America. Washington, D.C. feared revolutionary ideas. They would spread in the country like El Salvador and Guatemala, that we'll look in later on. As a result, the US intensified hostility. Through the Region Doctrine, America funded anti communist forces and increased economic pressure. Now, this created a self fulfilling cycle, the Cold War escalation spiral. The more threatened the Sandinista felt, the closer they moved towards the socialist bloc. And the closer they moved towards it, the more threatened the US felt. Mutual fear escalated the conflict, and this is one of the defining characteristics of a proxy war. Domestic politics becomes trapped inside a global ideological competition which cannot be escaped. The United States did not invade Nicaragua directly. We all know that. That's never happened, but we need to understand how the proxy war was engineered. In 1981, region authorized CIA covert operations to recruit, train, and arm anti Sandinista rebels known as the Contras. The Contras were not a single group, they included the former members of Somoza National Guard, the conservative Catholics who did not support the Sandinistas, disillusioned peasants, business elites, and the former Sandinista allies. To supporters, they were freedom fighters resisting authoritarian socialism that the Sandinista proposed. But to critics, they were terrorists responsible for attacks on civilians and infrastructure. We need to remember over here that these all were civilians of the same country. The US also used economic warfare. In 1985, Washington imposed a trade embargo that badly damaged Nicaragua's already weak economy. Internationally, the conflict became controversial. In 1986, the International Court of Justice ruled that US actions violated international law. And this is extremely significant. It shows that proxy wars are not only military struggles, they involve economics, diplomacy, law, intelligence agencies, and narrative warfare simultaneously. Now we arrive at a very important point, the symbolic center of my presentation, which is the 1984 elections in Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista won around 63% of the votes. International observers considered this election broadly fair, especially given the wartime conditions in Nicaragua. However, the Sandinista clearly had advantages. They controlled the state institutions, the state media, and possessed revolutionary legitimacy. There were also major criticisms seen. The wartime censorship affected opposition newspapers like Prensa, which was in Nicaragua. Some opposition groups boycotted the election. But here is a very crucial context. Unlike the neighboring US backed states, opposition groups in Nicaragua were not facing systematic death or any kind of terror. The key issue over here is whether Nicaragua had an imperfect democracy under wartime pressure, or was it fundamentally authoritarian but nobody saw it? Was it seen to be a fair election? During the 1984 election period, many events occurred. And when we deep dive into it, then we can find the answer to the major question that we have. International attention could have focused on important democratic questions like whether the election during wartime situation was meaningful or not. But instead, the narrative was very unique. The Reagan administration in the US leaked claims that Soviet MiG fighter jets were being delivered to Nicaragua. Now, the American media heavily covered this story. The problem was that the Soviet fighter jets never actually appeared in Nicaragua. So, public attention moved away from electoral legitimacy towards a manufactured security panic in the country. The public attention moving was very important because the media does not only report reality, it prioritizes reality. By changing what receives attention, the entire public conversation changes. And instead of debating democracy in the country, the audiences debated whether Soviet military expansion was happening in the country or not. This is a very key mechanism where manufacturing consent is seen. Now, it's very crucial we discuss propaganda model over here. The key idea is that the media systems do not apply standards equally. Compare Nicaragua with US aligned states like El Salvador and Guatemala, and you'll understand that in Nicaragua, media coverage became intensely focused on censorship and opposition boycotts. These issues were treated as a proof of illegitimacy of the country's democracy. And in Allied states, there were death squads, murdered journalists, and large scale state terror. Yet these issues often received far less moral outrage. This reveals a structural double standard. In enemy states, flaws are magnified. In allied states, even extreme violence can be seen as normalized or ignored. This does not mean that Nicaragua was perfect in the democracy. The point is that the media attention itself becomes selective, according to what the authorities want. The same actions are interpreted differently depending on geopolitical alignment. And this is exactly why Noam Chomsky discusses in the book that propaganda in liberal democracies works less through censorship and more through filtering. The input is the same set of raw facts: turnout, censorship, opposition acts, and violence. All the facts pass through an ideological filter. During the Cold War, anti communism was one of the strongest filters. So when the target was an enemy like Nicaragua, flaws became magnified. Censorship became fatal to legitimacy. And when the target was a US ally, even severe human rights could be minimized as unfortunate background conditions. The important takeaway over here is that bias is always structural and not just individual. Journalists do not necessarily need to lie. The system itself shapes which stories appear important, urgent, or morally significant. So, media narratives become connected to the state's interests, ownership structures, ideology, and geopolitical strategies. In 1990, Nicaragua had experienced a decade of war, sanctions, hyperinflation, and exhaustion. The population was tired. In the election, voters chose that US backed opposition coalition led by Violeta Chamorro is now the critical leader. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista accepted defeat and transferred power peacefully. This complicates the simplistic idea that Sandinistas were merely a communist dictatorship refusing democracy. Historically, this was very unusual. A revolutionary government that came to power through armed struggle voluntarily handed over their power through elections to a US backed opposition. This does not erase the criticism of the Sandinistas, but it forces us to move beyond simplistic binaries. History is usually more complicated than propaganda narratives allow it to be. One final comparison that we must do with Nicaragua, which matters today, is a strong parallel that exists. Nicaragua was a story of 1984, but Venezuela is just the recent years. Both were involved in socialist anti imperialist governments. Both faced sanctions, US hostility, and opposition boycotts. Both were quickly labeled illegitimate by the Washington. However, there is one key difference between both case studies. Many observers consider Nicaragua's 1984 election broadly fair within wartime conditions. In contrast to that, recent Venezuelan elections faced far more severe criticism from international monitoring groups. So the lesson is that every anti-American government is automatically democratic. The deeper lesson over here that we need to understand and critically think about is that media framing and geopolitical interests strongly shape public perception. But factual conditions on the ground still matter because we must analyze both of the structures of narratives and the reality itself. To conclude, Nicaragua demonstrates that elections are never only about voting. In global politics, elections become symbols, they become tools for legitimacy, and legitimacy itself is not often shaped through media systems, ideology, and geopolitical alignment. The Nicaraguan case teaches us three major lessons. First, revolutions emerge from historical conditions, not isolated movements. Second, the Cold War transformed local conflicts into proxy wars, where ordinary societies became battlegrounds for superpower competition. Third, media narratives are not neutral. They help determine which governments are viewed as democratic, authoritarian, legitimate, or dangerous. And ultimately, Nicaragua forces us to ask one deeper question: who gets to define democracy in global politics? And how much of that definition depends not on a universal principle, but on power? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imtisal. If anyone has any question from Imtisal, the purpose of her presentation was to build a case study about what were the conditions of Nicaragua before going deeper into Chapter 3 and analyzing all of the parameters of a fair election in Nicaragua.